When they pulled me out from beneath that plantation house in the summer of 1858, I was more bone than child, more shadow than flesh, and the first thing I saw was my father's face looking down at me like I was something that had clawed its way up from hell. He didn't say my name, he didn't reach for me. He just stared, and in that stare I understood something that took me years to put into words. I was never meant to survive. So, tell me, if you were 8 years old and you realized the man who helped bring you into this world had also tried to erase you from it, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to stay alive, or would you have waited for the day you could burn everything he built straight to the ground? My name is Eliza, though that wasn't the name written in the plantation ledger beside my mother's. In those books, she was listed as Mary Fieldhand, age 23, like that was the sum of her existence. We lived on Beaumont Plantation just outside St. Therese, Martin Parish, Louisiana, where the air in August felt thick enough to swallow, and the cicadas screamed from the trees like they were warning us that something was always coming. The house itself stood on raised brick pillars, white columns stretching toward a sky that rarely looked merciful, and beneath it was a crawl space of packed dirt and shadow that most folks pretended didn't exist. That space became my world. But before I was the child beneath the house, I was just Mary's girl. I remember my mother's laugh more than her face sometimes, the way it would break free of her even after a 14-hour day in the fields. She'd hum old spirituals while braiding my hair, her fingers gentle despite the blisters lining her palms. "You keep your head down, Liza," she'd whisper. "You see less that way." I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now. The master of the plantation, Henry Beaumont, was a man who liked to think of himself as refined. He wore tailored coats even in the heat and carried a silver watch he'd check, as if time itself answered to him. His wife, Eleanor Beaumont, was pale and sharp-eyed, always dressed in soft colors that made her look like something fragile, though there was nothing fragile about her will. They had once had a son, born sickly and gone before his first birthday. People said the fever took him. Some whispered other things when they thought no one could hear. I was born the same year their son died. No one said it outright, but everyone saw it. My skin was lighter than my mother's, my eyes a gray that did not belong to her line. Henry Beaumont never looked at me for long, but when he did, something flickered across his face like he was staring into a mirror he didn't want mounted on his wall. Eleanor never looked at me at all. The night everything changed started with shouting. I was 8 years old, lying on a pallet beside my mother in our small cabin in the quarters, when the overseer's voice cut through the darkness. Mary had been sick for days, coughing until her whole body shook, but sickness was not an excuse that earned mercy on that land. They dragged her out before sunrise, and I followed barefoot crying, until the overseer shoved me back so hard I fell into the dirt. Henry Beaumont stood a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back, watching like this was a matter of livestock, not a woman struggling to breathe. "She can't work," the overseer said flatly. "Then she's of no use," Henry replied. Those words burned into me. Of no use. They moved her into a small storage room off the kitchen, not out of kindness, but because Eleanor feared fever spreading among the workforce. I tried to slip inside to see her, but a kitchen maid blocked the door. "Go on, child," she whispered. "You don't want to see." I never did see her again. By the next evening, they told me she was dead and buried behind the tree line without ceremony. No marker, no prayer, just dirt. And I stopped speaking after that. It wasn't a choice at first. The words just wouldn't come. Grief hollowed me out until I felt like one of the empty barrels stacked by the barn. A few days later, I overheard 2 house servants whispering near the well. "They're sending us south," one said. "Master don't want reminders." Sending me south meant selling me deeper into Louisiana, maybe to the sugar fields where children didn't last long. I understood enough to know that meant disappearing forever. That night, Just after the lanterns were extinguished in the big house, someone shook me awake. It was old Samuel, the plantation carpenter, a man with hands scarred from decades of work and eyes that still held a quiet kindness. "You trust me," he whispered. I nodded because I had no one else left. He led me behind the main house and crouched beside one of the brick pillars. With effort, he pried up a loose board along the edge. A breath of damp, earthy air escaped from the darkness below. "Get in," he urged, "and don't make a sound." I stared into that blackness, fear rising like bile, but the alternative was worse. I lowered myself into the crawl space, dirt coating my hands and knees. Samuel replaced the board above me, sealing me into a world of shadow. At first, I thought I would suffocate. The space was barely high enough to sit upright. I could see thin blades of light slipping through cracks in the floorboards overhead. Dust drifted down with every footstep above. I could hear everything: the scrape of chairs, the clink of crystal glasses, Eleanor's light footsteps crossing what must have been the parlor. It was like living inside the bones of the house. Samuel brought me scraps when he could: cornbread wrapped in cloth, a small tin of water, but he couldn't come often without drawing suspicion. Days blurred together. Hunger gnawed at me until it felt like a living thing inside my belly. I licked condensation from the cool brick pillars. I pressed my ear to the dirt and imagined I could hear my mother's voice humming through the ground. And then, one night, I heard a different voice. "You're not supposed to be here." I jerked upright, heart slamming against my ribs. The voice was soft, a child's voice, echoing faintly in the darkness. I crawled toward the sound, hands shaking. "Who's there?" I whispered. And a pause. Then, "This is my house." I told myself it was rats in the beams, wind through the cracks, the sound of my own thoughts unraveling. But the voice returned the next night and the next. It spoke of rooms above, of a nursery filled with sunlight, of a fever that burned and a mother who wept. "You look like him," it said once. "Like who?" I breathed. "Like father." Cold swept through me despite the stifling heat. I knew without being told who that meant. Weeks passed. My body grew thinner, my senses sharper. I learned the rhythm of the house. I knew when Henry left for town, when Eleanor paced in the hallway outside what used to be the nursery. Sometimes I'd crawl to a particular crack and watch her through it as she stood in that room, fingers brushing the crib that still sat in the corner. Grief clung to her like perfume. One afternoon I heard raised voices above me. "She's gone," Henry insisted. "You can't be sure," Eleanor replied. "You didn't look everywhere." "Why would I look under my own floorboards?" he snapped. Silence fell heavy after that. I pressed my face into the dirt, realizing how close discovery had come. Samuel stopped coming after that day. I waited 2 days, 3. My stomach cramped so violently I could barely move. I began to think he'd been caught helping me, and paid dearly for it. The voice in the dark grew quieter, too, as if it were fading along with my strength. "Come further," it whispered one night. I crawled toward the far end of the crawl space where the earth dipped lower and the air felt colder. My hand struck something solid. I dug at the dirt with trembling fingers until I uncovered a small hollow carved into the ground. Inside lay scraps of rotted cloth and the brittle remains of something too small to be an animal. Tiny bones. My breath left me in a broken sob. I didn't fully understand, but I understood enough. The fevered sun. The grief. The secret burial. "You stayed," the voice murmured. So did I. The next thing I remember is light exploding around me. The board above was ripped away, and hands reached down, hauling me up like a sack of grain. I screamed, my throat raw. The sudden brightness blinded me. When my vision cleared, I saw Henry Beaumont standing a few feet away, face pale as death. "She's alive," someone whispered. Eleanor pushed through the crowd of servants, her eyes wide as she took in my skeletal frame. For a moment, I saw horror there. Then something else, recognition. They carried me inside the house I had listened to for weeks from below. The floors were smooth and cool against my skin. They laid me in the old nursery, the very room the voice had described. I stared at the ceiling, half convinced I was still beneath it. Henry didn't visit. Eleanor did. On the second evening, she entered alone, closing the door behind her. She stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped tightly. "Do you know who your father is?" she asked. I looked at her and saw not just a mistress, but a woman who had buried a child and found another in his place. I could have spoken. I could have said his name. Instead, I shook my head. Her shoulders sagged in relief. That was the moment I chose silence. Now I need you to think about something, because this is where my story could have gone another way. I was 8 years old, weak but alive, in a room that once belonged to a dead child who might have been my brother. I knew the man who owned that house was likely my father. I knew he had tried to sell me away, and I knew his wife was standing before me, desperate for something she had lost. If you had been me, would you have told the truth right then? Would you have forced her to see what he had done, or would you have swallowed it down and waited for the right moment to use it? Before I tell you what I did next and how it led to the fall of everything the Beaumont name stood for, I want you to pause and ask yourself honestly what you would have done in my place. Because I didn't just survive that house. Years later, I destroyed it. I didn't understand it fully then, lying in that narrow bed in the nursery. But silence is a weapon when you have nothing else. I was 8 years old, skeletal and weak, yet I had something Henry Beaumont did not expect me to have. I had knowledge. I had heard his voice through the floorboards. I had heard his fear. I had seen the way Eleanor looked at me, not with hatred, but with something dangerously close to longing. And I realized, slowly, that I was no longer just a problem to be discarded. I was leverage. The weeks after they pulled me from beneath the house passed in a strange, suspended haze. Eleanor insisted I remain in the nursery, away from the quarters, away from gossip. To the other enslaved families, I had vanished. To the outside world, I did not exist. Henry avoided the room entirely, as if stepping inside would force him to confront something he could not bear to name. But Eleanor came every day. At first she asked small questions. What did I remember from before I went under the house? Had anyone helped me? Did I hear anyone speaking? Each time, I answered carefully. I never mentioned Samuel. I never mentioned the bones. And I never mentioned the voice. She watched me the way someone studies a painting they can't decide whether to hang or burn. "You have his eyes," she murmured once, almost to herself. I lowered my gaze. "Yes, ma'am." That answer seemed to settle something inside her. I think, in her own twisted way, she needed to hear me say it without accusation. Outside those nursery walls, the plantation moved as it always had, cotton picked, sugarcane harvested, orders barked and obeyed. But something in the air had shifted. There were whispers about unrest, about northern abolitionists stirring trouble, about Lincoln's name being spoken more boldly. I didn't understand politics, but I understood tension. It hummed through the house like a low, constant note. One night, I heard Henry and Eleanor arguing in the hallway, just beyond my door. "She should be sent away," Henry said sharply. "This cannot continue." "And explain what?" Eleanor shot back. "That a child survived under our own floorboards without your knowledge." His voice dropped. "You think I don't know what people would assume?" "I don't care what they assume," she replied, and for the first time I heard steel in her voice. "I lost a son. I will not lose another child to your cowardice." Silence followed. Heavy, dangerous silence. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding, understanding something vital. Eleanor did not see me as Mary's daughter. She saw me as an answer to her grief, and Henry saw me as proof of his sin. That imbalance became my shield. My strength returned slowly. Eleanor ordered dresses tailored for me from leftover fabric. She hired a tutor under the guise of educating a distant relative sent to live with us. No one was to mention my time beneath the house. Officially, I had been ill in the quarters. Officially, I had been brought into the house out of charity. More officially, I had crossed a line no one could uncross. The first time Henry was forced to sit across from me at dinner, I watched him carefully. He barely touched his food. When our eyes met, something flickered there. Guilt, yes, but also resentment. I reminded him of a mistake he could not erase. And perhaps, deeper than that, I reminded him of his son. You will address Mr. Beaumont properly, Eleanor instructed me gently. Yes, ma'am, I said, then turned to him. Thank you for the meal, sir. The word sir tasted bitter on my tongue. Years rolled forward, and with them came 1861 and the thunderclap of war. Louisiana seceded. Men gathered in town squares shouting about honor and rights and defending their way of life. Henry joined the Confederacy with dramatic flair, as if marching off to war might absolve him of sins committed at home. The day he left, Eleanor stood straight-backed on the porch, waving a handkerchief. I stood beside her, silent. As his horse disappeared down the road, she exhaled a breath that sounded almost like relief. Without Henry in the house, something shifted again. Eleanor's grip on me tightened, but it was no longer purely about control. It felt almost maternal. She taught me to read fluently. She showed me how to play hymns on the piano in the parlor. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit beside me and speak of her lost son, Thomas. He had your eyes, she said once, her voice trembling. I didn't tell her I knew. I didn't tell her about the hollow beneath the house, about the tiny bones wrapped in cloth. I didn't tell her that sometimes, in my dreams, I still heard a boy's voice whispering in the dark. The war dragged on. Union troops pushed deeper into Louisiana. Rumors of emancipation spread like wildfire. Enslaved families began slipping away under cover of darkness, chasing the promise of freedom. By 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the plantation was unraveling. Laborers left, crops failed. The grand facade of Beaumont prosperity began to rot from within. Henry did not return. A letter arrived in late 1864, edges worn and ink faded. Eleanor read it alone in her bedroom. When she emerged, her face was pale but composed. He died bravely, she announced to the remaining staff. I watched her carefully. I did not know whether that was truth or mercy. With Henry gone and the Confederacy collapsing, Union soldiers rode onto the property in early 1865. I stood once again on the porch, this time taller, older, no longer the starved child dragged from beneath the floor. An officer dismounted and approached. "Who resides here?" he demanded. Eleanor's hand found my shoulder. I felt her hesitation. In that pause was the weight of every secret she carried. My daughter and I, she said firmly. That lie, if it was a lie, saved us. The officer nodded curtly and ordered an inventory of the property. The plantation was seized, its remaining assets divided or sold. The era of Beaumont dominance ended not with flames, but with paperwork. Eleanor sold what remained of the estate and moved us to New Orleans, where the past could be blurred by the noise of the city. I was introduced as Eliza Beaumont, her ward first, then gradually, quietly, her daughter. No one questioned it. In the aftermath of war, people were too busy rebuilding their own shattered lives. But here is where everything began to shift toward the choice that would define me. In New Orleans, away from the plantation, Eleanor softened in ways I had not expected. She laughed occasionally. She attended church regularly. She even allowed me to attend school with other girls. Yet beneath that surface there was always something unspoken between us, a truth neither of us dared to confront. When I turned 17, I found Henry's old ledger among Eleanor's belongings. It had been packed away hastily during the move. Inside were lists of names, ages, prices, and there, written in neat script, was my mother's name, Mary, field hand, value, $800. Further down the page in smaller writing was a note, child, female, to be transferred. No name, no value assigned, just to be transferred. My hands trembled as I turned the page, and then I saw it. A folded letter tucked between the sheets. The seal had been broken long ago. I recognized Henry's handwriting instantly. Eleanor, he had written. The child cannot remain. I made a mistake in weakness, and now it threatens everything. Sell her south before anyone begins to notice. I will not have my legacy undone by a lapse in judgment. That word ignited something inside me that had been smoldering since I was 8 years old. I was not a lapse in judgment. I was a life. I confronted Eleanor that night. She sat by the window, lamplight casting shadows across her face. And you knew, I said quietly. And she didn't ask what I meant. Yes. And you let him try to sell me. And her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know he had arranged it until after. Samuel told me. Samuel saved me. I know. The silence between us felt heavier than the dirt that had once pressed against my back beneath the house. Why did you claim me? I demanded. Her voice broke. Because I saw my son when I looked at you. Because I could not bear to lose another child. Because I loved you. The word love hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous. And that is where my final choice began to take shape. I had proof now. Henry's own words, his intent to sell me, to erase me, his acknowledgement, however veiled, of what I was to him. I could have burned the letter. I could have kept living as Eliza Beaumont, daughter of a respectable widow, leaving the past buried beneath Louisiana soil. So before I tell you what I chose and how it unraveled everything Eleanor tried to rebuild, I want you to think again. If the man who fathered you tried to sell you like property, and his name was still spoken with respect in certain circles, would you let history remember him kindly? Or would you make sure the truth clawed its way into the light? Because I did not stay silent forever. And when I finally spoke, the Beaumont name did not survive it. I held that letter in my hands for 3 days before I decided what kind of woman I was going to become. For 3 days, I moved through the house in New Orleans like a ghost, Eleanor watching me with a quiet dread she didn't try to hide. She knew I had found something. She knew the past we had both pretended was settled had shifted under our feet. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw dirt pressing in from all sides. I heard that child's voice beneath the plantation house whispering, "You stayed, so did I." But here is the truth I had not yet allowed myself to fully see. The bones beneath the house were not Thomas Beaumont's. I realized that on the second night. The memory came back slowly, like a lantern being turned up inch by inch. The hollow in the earth had been too shallow for a coffin. The scraps of cloth had not been fine nursery linen, but rough, faded fabric like the kind used in the quarters. And the bones, they had been smaller than those of a toddler, too small for a 1-year-old boy. Thomas Beaumont had been buried in the family plot. I remembered overhearing that as a child in the quarters. There had been a service, a headstone. So whose bones had I found? And the answer came like ice sliding down my spine. Not Thomas. Another child. Another secret. And if there had been another child hidden beneath that house before me, then I was not the first mistake Henry Beaumont had tried to bury. On the third day, I went to Eleanor. She was seated at her writing desk, spectacles perched low on her nose, pretending to read correspondence she hadn't turned the page of in several minutes. When she saw the letter in my hand, she closed her eyes briefly. There was another child, I said. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. Before me. And she did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. Her name was Ruth. The name felt foreign and sacred all at once. She was born 2 years before you, Eleanor continued, to another woman in the quarters. I did not know at first. Diesel, I could not bear the humiliation. My throat tightened. He didn't sell her. Eleanor's silence was confirmation. She grew ill, Eleanor whispered. There was fever in the quarters that year. She died before any sale was arranged. Was she buried properly? Her gaze flickered away. And there it was, the final piece. Ruth had died, quietly, in the quarters, no service, no record beyond a line in the ledger, and somehow, someway, her small body had ended up beneath the very house Henry Beaumont ruled from, hidden, forgotten, erased. The voice I had heard in the darkness had not been Thomas, the mourned son. It had been Ruth. Another daughter no one claimed. And you're like me, the voice had said. Unwanted. The realization did not frighten me. It steadied me. Because now this was no longer just about revenge. It was about memory. About refusing to let girls like Ruth and my mother be reduced to ink on a ledger. I'm going to publish it, I said quietly. Eleanor's head snapped up. Eliza, think carefully. I have thought carefully. But in certain circles, particularly among former Confederates rebuilding their reputations, his name was spoken with admiration. He had died bravely. He had been a pillar of the community. History was already reshaping him into something noble. I had the letter that proved otherwise. I began writing that very week. Not a pamphlet filled with rage, not a bitter accusation. I wrote an account, calm, factual. I described Beaumont Plantation. I described my mother. I described the attempted sale. I did not embellish. I did not scream. I simply told the truth. And at the heart of it, I included Henry's own words, "I will not have my legacy undone by a lapse in judgment." I signed it not as Eliza Beaumont, but as Eliza Mary. My mother's name. When the account was published in a small but growing abolitionist paper in 1870, the reaction was immediate and violent. Letters poured in. Some called me a liar seeking attention. Others expressed horror. A few former plantation workers from St. Martin Parish wrote in to confirm that I had vanished one summer and reappeared months later, thinner than bone. The story spread beyond Louisiana. Northern papers picked it up. The phrase, "child beneath the plantation house," became a headline. And with that, the Beaumont legacy cracked. Former associates distanced themselves from Henry's memory. Monuments proposed in his honor were quietly abandoned. Investors who had once considered partnering with Eleanor in post-war ventures withdrew. Our comfortable life in New Orleans began to unravel. Eleanor never asked me to retract it, but I saw the toll it took. Whispers followed her at church. Invitations ceased. Women who once sat beside her now chose other pews. The social circle she had rebuilt so carefully collapsed under the weight of my words. One evening, months after publication, she came into my room and sat at the foot of my bed much like she had when I was 8. "Are you satisfied?" she asked softly. "About Mary? About the crawl space and the voice in the dark?" No," I said honestly, "but I'm at peace." She nodded slowly. "I cannot undo what I allowed," she said, "but I am glad you did not become silent like I did." Those were the last real words we spoke about it. Eleanor's health declined over the next few years. Grief ages people in ways no doctor can treat. On her deathbed, she reached for my hand. "I loved you," she whispered. And for the first time, I believed her completely. After she passed, I did something no Beaumont had ever done. I returned to St. Martin Parish. The plantation was barely recognizable. The house stood abandoned, columns cracked, paint peeling. Nature was reclaiming it inch by inch. I walked around to the side where Samuel had once pried up that loose board. The crawlspace entrance had long since rotted away, but I found the general area and knelt in the dirt. I did not go beneath it again. Instead, I arranged for a proper excavation. It took days of careful digging, but eventually we found the hollow I remembered. The small bones were still there, fragile but undeniable. I paid for a simple coffin. I paid for a headstone. Ruth, daughter, remembered. Duh, remembered. There was no surname carved beneath it. She did not need one. As for Beaumont Plantation, I used what remained of Eleanor's estate to purchase the land outright once it went up for auction. Not to restore it, not to live in it, to dismantle it. The house was torn down beam by beam, the wood sold, the bricks repurposed for homes in the parish, the land divided and sold to families who had once labored on it without pay. I stood there the day the last column fell. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like release. Now, when I look back, I do not think of myself as the child beneath the house. I think of myself as the girl who climbed out and refused to crawl back into silence. Was I wrong to expose a dead man? Some would say yes. They would argue that the war had already punished him, that the South had already suffered enough, that dredging up old sins only deepened wounds. But here is what I know. Silence protects the powerful. Truth protects the forgotten. If I had stayed quiet, Henry Beaumont would have been remembered as honorable. Ruth would have remained bones in the dirt. My mother would have been nothing more than a line and a ledger. And if you had been me 8 years old, starving beneath a plantation house, listening to the voice of another discarded child whisper that you were not alone, tell me honestly, would you have chosen differently? Would you have forgiven and forgotten? And would you have waited, like I did, for the moment when the truth could no longer be buried? If you believe I did what I had to do, if you believe some legacies deserve to fall, then like this video. If you think I should have let the past stay in the ground, tell me why in the comments. I truly want to hear what you would have done. And if you want more stories about the secrets history tried to hide beneath its floorboards, make sure you subscribe. Some houses rot from the inside long before they collapse. I'll see you in the next story.